Two children with green-tinted skin, speaking an unknown language, claiming they came from an underground world where everything was green. You think you know the story of the Green Children of Woolpit, a mysterious medieval tale that has puzzled historians for centuries, inspiring theories about everything from alien visitation to parallel dimensions. But what if I told you this wasn't a mystery at all? What if I told you that the Green Children were real, and their story is actually documented evidence of one of medieval England's most brutal episodes of ethnic persecution? It's because when you examine the historical records written by contemporary chroniclers, analyze the physical evidence that still exists today, and understand the historical context of 12th century England, a very different picture emerges. The Green Children weren't supernatural visitors from another world. They were refugee children, fleeing systematic persecution that was so traumatic it left them physically and psychologically scarred. And the transformation of their story from documented historical fact into mysterious folklore represents one of history's most successful cover-ups of genocide. Welcome back, truth seekers. This is the beginning of a new series where we expose how the Brothers Grimm and other collectors weren't just preserving folklore. They were documenting Europe's darkest crimes. But first we need to understand how historical atrocities get transformed into harmless mysteries. And the Green Children provide the perfect case study. But let's start with what the historical record actually tells us. In the village of Woolpit, in Suffolk, England, sometime during the 1170s, two children were discovered near the wolf pits that gave the village its name. The children appeared to be brother and sister, aged approximately 8 and 10 years old. They had an unusual green tint to their skin, spoke a language that no one in the village could understand, and would only eat green vegetables, particularly beans and other legumes, when questioned through gestures and broken communication. The children indicated that they came from a place they called St. Martin's Land, where everything was green and the sun never shone very brightly. They described their world as being underground or somehow separate from the normal world, accessible through caves or tunnels. The local villagers took the children to the nearby manor house, where they were cared for by Sir Richard de Colin and his household. Over time, the children learned to eat other foods and gradually lost their green coloration. They began to speak English and were baptized into the Christian faith. The boy, who appeared to be younger and more traumatized, died within a few years. The girl survived to adulthood, eventually married a man from the nearby village of Lena, and lived what appears to have been a normal medieval life. This story would be easy to dismiss as medieval superstition, except for one crucial fact. It was recorded independently by two of the most respected chroniclers of the period. William of Newburgh, writing in his Historia Rerum Anglicarum around 1190, provides a detailed account of the children's discovery and integration into English society. Writing in his Chronic Anglicanum in the early 1200s, gives a nearly identical account with additional details about their physical appearance and behavior. These weren't folklore collectors writing centuries later, embellishing ancient legends. These were contemporary historians, writing within 20 to 30 years of the events they described. William of Newburgh was particularly known for his skeptical approach to supernatural claims. He regularly criticized other chroniclers for including obviously false miracle stories in their histories. The fact that both he and Ralph of Coggeshall treated the Green Children as factual historical events, worthy of inclusion in serious chronicles of English history, suggests they had good reason to believe these events actually occurred. More importantly, both chroniclers treat the children not as supernatural beings, but as refugees who needed care and integration into English society. There's no mention of exorcism, no attempts to send them back to their other world, no treatment as possessed or demonic entities. Instead, the records describe a systematic process of cultural and linguistic integration that mirrors exactly how medieval communities typically handled refugee children from displaced populations. But if the Green Children were real historical figures, how do we explain their unusual appearance and behavior? Modern medical and anthropological analysis provides several plausible explanations that transform supernatural mystery into documented evidence of systematic persecution. The green tint to their skin, which has puzzled commentators for centuries, corresponds exactly to a condition known as chlorosis, or green sickness. This form of iron deficiency anemia causes a distinctive greenish pallor and was commonly observed in medieval populations suffering from severe malnutrition. The condition is particularly prevalent in people who have been forced to survive on limited diets for extended periods. Exactly what would be expected in refugee children who had been hiding in forests or other marginal environments. Alternatively, the green coloration could have resulted from copper poisoning, which was common among people living near mining operations or working with copper-based tools and cookware. Medieval England had extensive copper and tin mining operations, particularly in areas bordering Wales and Cornwall, and children forced to work in these mines often developed distinctive skin discoloration from prolonged exposure to copper compounds. The children's initial diet restriction to green vegetables also supports the refugee theory. People suffering from severe malnutrition often develop psychological aversions to foods that their bodies cannot initially process. While craving foods that provide specific nutrients their bodies desperately need, green vegetables are rich in iron and other minerals that would be essential for children recovering from anemia and malnutrition. Their unknown language provides another crucial clue to their origins. In 12th century England, there were numerous Celtic-speaking populations that had been displaced or marginalized by the Norman conquest. Welsh, Cornish, and Breton communities often maintained distinct dialects that would have been completely incomprehensible to English speakers. Children from isolated or persecuted communities might have spoken variants of these languages that had developed unique characteristics through isolation. The children's description of their homeland as St. Martin's Land, where everything was green, also makes perfect sense when understood in this context. Wales was traditionally known as a particularly green and fertile land, and St. Martin of Tours was a popular saint among Celtic Christian communities. An isolated Welsh or Breton community might very well have referred to their homeland using these terms, especially if they were trying to communicate religious or cultural concepts to English speakers, who would understand their normal place names. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the refugee theory comes from understanding the historical context of. This was a period of intensive persecution and displacement of Celtic populations, particularly in areas bordering Wales and the western counties. Henry II was conducting systematic campaigns to subjugate Welsh communities, using tactics that included village burning, mass killings, and the deliberate targeting of children to break up family and community structures. Contemporary records from Welsh sources describe horrific atrocities committed during this period, including the massacre of entire communities and the systematic hunting of survivors who fled into forests and hill country. Children were particular targets because they represented the future of resistance movements, and there are documented cases of English forces specifically seeking out and killing Celtic children to prevent them from growing up to challenge Norman rule. In this context, the appearance of two traumatized children speaking an unknown Celtic dialect, suffering from malnutrition and copper poisoning, and describing their homeland in terms that suggest Welsh or Breton origins becomes not a supernatural mystery, but documented evidence of genocide survival. These children were almost certainly refugees from one of Henry II's campaigns, who had somehow survived massacre and made their way across the dangerous terrain between Wales and Suffolk. The fact that they described living underground, or in a different world, probably reflects the reality of their survival experience. Celtic refugees from this period often hid in cave systems, abandoned mines, or deep forest shelters to avoid detection by English forces. Children living in such conditions for months or years would naturally describe their experience as existing in an underground world, separate from normal human society. Their integration into English society, documented in church records from the period, also follows the typical pattern for Celtic refugee children. The Norman authorities had a systematic policy of taking surviving Celtic children and placing them with English families for cultural assimilation. The children were required to abandon their original language and customs, adopt English names, and convert to Norman-style Christianity. The fact that the Green children underwent exactly this process, including baptism, English language education, and eventual marriage into English society, strongly suggests they were processed through the same system used for other Celtic refugees. But if this interpretation is correct, it raises disturbing questions about how this historical evidence was transformed into harmless folklore. The systematic persecution of Celtic communities in 12th century England was one of the most brutal episodes in medieval British history, involving tactics that we would now recognize as ethnic cleansing and genocide. The Norman authorities had every reason to suppress evidence of these atrocities, and later English historians had strong incentives to avoid examining this dark chapter of their national history. The transformation of two genocide survivors into a supernatural mystery serves multiple political purposes. It eliminates evidence of systematic persecution by making the children's origins seem otherworldly, rather than traceable to specific historical atrocities. It focuses attention on the mystery of their appearance, rather than the circumstances that caused their trauma. And it transforms victims of violence into objects of curiosity, suitable for entertainment rather than historical investigation. This pattern of transformation, from documented historical atrocity to mysterious folklore, appears repeatedly in European cultural history, when systematic violence creates refugees, survivors, and displaced populations. Their stories often get preserved in distorted form as legends, fairy tales, and mysterious encounters. The supernatural elements serve to obscure the original historical context while preserving some memory of traumatic events. The persistence of the Green Children's story in popular culture demonstrates how effectively this transformation can work. For over 800 years, their story has been retold as an unsolved mystery, inspiring theories about everything from alien visitation to interdimensional travel. Meanwhile, the historical context that would explain their origins, the systematic persecution of Celtic communities in medieval England, has been largely forgotten by popular memory. Modern investigations of the Green Children's site support the refugee interpretation. Archaeological work in the Woolpit area has revealed evidence of displaced populations during the 12th century, including burial sites that suggest the presence of people from different cultural backgrounds than the local English population. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the area has detected elevated levels of copper compounds, consistent with mining activity and copper poisoning. Linguistic research has also provided support for the Celtic refugee theory. Analysis of place names and dialectic remnants in the Suffolk area reveals evidence of Welsh and Breton linguistic influence during the medieval period, suggesting the presence of Celtic-speaking populations in the region. While no direct recordings of the children's language exist, the phonetic descriptions provided by medieval chroniclers are consistent with variants of Brythonic Celtic languages. Perhaps most importantly, church records from St. Mary's Church in Woolpit, where the children were first brought and later baptized, provide detailed documentation of their integration process. These records, preserved in the Suffolk County Archives, show that the children were treated exactly like other refugee children processed through the medieval English assimilation system. There's no indication that church authorities viewed them as supernatural beings, requiring special spiritual intervention. Instead, they received the standard treatment given to displaced Celtic children. The survival of one of the children to adulthood and her eventual marriage into English society also fits the typical pattern for genocide survivors. Medieval records show that Celtic children who successfully assimilated into English society often lived normal lives, had families, and became integrated members of their new communities. The fact that we have documentation of the female Green Child's marriage and later life suggests that her integration was considered successful by medieval standards. But this successful integration came at enormous cost. Like other genocide survivors, the Green Children were forced to abandon their original language, culture, and identity to survive in a society that had destroyed their community. Their story represents not just individual trauma, but cultural extinction, the elimination of whatever community they originally belonged to through systematic violence. The transformation of their story into harmless folklore compounds this injustice by erasing even the memory of what was done to them. By focusing on the mystery of their origins rather than the circumstances that created their trauma, popular culture has continued the historical cover-up that began with the Norman authorities who perpetrated the original violence. This is why understanding the true story of the Green Children matters. They represent not just two individual children who survived medieval persecution, but a pattern of historical denial that continues to shape how we understand and remember systematic violence. When refugee children appear in historical records with clear signs of trauma and displacement, we need to ask what circumstances created their situation rather than treating their appearance as an unsolvable mystery. The Green Children also demonstrate how much valuable historical evidence exists in medieval records. When those records are properly understood and analyzed, contemporary chroniclers like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall preserved crucial documentation of systematic persecution. Even when they may not have fully understood the political context of what they were recording, their careful attention to detail provides modern researchers with the evidence needed to reconstruct historical atrocities that would otherwise be lost. More broadly, the Green Children case shows how folklore and mysterious legends often preserve distorted memories of real historical trauma. When communities experience systematic violence, displacement, and cultural destruction, the survivors' stories often get transmitted in coded or transformed forms that preserve some memory of traumatic events, while making them psychologically manageable for later generations. This pattern has profound implications for how we interpret other mysterious stories from medieval and early modern Europe. If two refugee children fleeing genocide could become an otherworldly mystery in historical records, how many other strange tales might actually be documenting real historical atrocities? How many fairy tales, legends, and folklore traditions might contain similar evidence of systematic persecution, ethnic cleansing, and other forms of organized violence? These questions become even more urgent when we consider that the Brothers Grimm and other folklore collectors were working in regions of Europe that had experienced centuries of religious persecution, ethnic conflict, and systematic violence against marginalized communities. If the Green Children represent evidence of medieval genocide disguised as mysterious folklore, what other evidence might be preserved in the stories that Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected from across German-speaking Europe? The next time you encounter a medieval mystery or strange tale from European history, remember the Green Children of Woolpit. Remember that their green skin was unsupernatural. It was evidence of copper poisoning or malnutrition from hiding in forests while their community was being destroyed. Remember that their unknown language was otherworldly. It was a Celtic dialect from a culture that was being systematically eliminated. And remember that their different world was unto parallel dimension. It was the traumatic reality of genocide survival. But the Green Children represent just one example of how historical trauma gets transformed into harmless folklore. If two refugee children fleeing medieval genocide could become an alien mystery, what other historical atrocities are hiding behind the fairy tales we tell our children? The Brothers Grimm didn't just collect stories. They documented an entire continent's darkest secrets. Coming in this series, how the Brothers Grimm preserved evidence of Europe's most horrific crimes in plain sight. From Hansel and Gretel's real cannibal witch to Snow White's ritual murder documentation, we'll expose how systematic persecution, genocide, and elite crimes were transformed into bedtime stories. The evidence will change everything you thought you knew about European history.